Hello, Rokeby. I'm going to read to you today one of the stories from the Anthony Horowitz book that had the brilliant story about the bath in at the beginning. This is one of the ones near the end. It's called Twist Cottage. I never knew my mother. She died in a car accident the year after I was born, and I was brought up all on my own by my dad. I had no brothers and no sisters. There were just the two of us, living in a house in Bath, which is down the southwest, in Avon. My dad worked as a history lecturer at Bristol University, and for 10 years we had nannies or housekeepers living with us, looking after me. But by the time I was 13 and going to a local school, we found we didn't really need anyone anymore. So there were just the two of us, and we were happy. My dad's name is Andrew Taylor. He never talked about my mother, but I think he must have loved her a lot because he didn't remarry, and although he doesn't like me to know it, he kept a photograph of her in his wallet and never went anywhere without it. He was a big, shaggy man with glasses and an untidy brown haircut that had just started to go grey. His clothes always looked old, even when they were brand new, and they never fitted him very well. He was 45. He went to the cinema a lot. He listened to classical music, and like me, he supported Arsenal. The two of us always got on well, perhaps because we always had our own space. We only had a small house in Bath. It was in one of the back streets behind the antique market, but we both had our own rooms. Dad had a small study on the ground floor, and when I was 10, he converted the attic into a play area for me. It was a little cramped with a slanting roof and only one small window, but it was fine for me, somewhere private where I could go. In fact, we didn't see much of each other during the week. He was at university and I was at school. But at weekends we went to films together, did the shopping, watched TV or kicked a football around, all the things that every father does with every son. Only there was no mother to share it. We were happy, but everything changed with the coming of Louise. I suppose it had to happen in the end. My dad might be middle-aged, but he was still fit and reasonably good-looking. I knew he went out with women now and then, but until Louise, none of them had ever stayed. She was a few years younger than him. She was a mature student at Bristol University. She was studying art, but she had taken history as an option, and that was how they met. The first time I met her, she'd come round to the house to pick up a book, and I have to say, I could see what my dad saw in her. She was a very beautiful woman, tall and slim, with dark hair, brown eyes, and a very slight French accent. Her mother lived in Paris. She was smartly dressed in a silk dress that showed off her figure perfectly. The one thing that was strange, though, was that, for a student, she didn't seem particularly interested in either history or art. When my dad talked about some gallery he'd been to, she was soon yawning, although she was careful to hide it behind a handkerchief. And whenever he asked her about her work, she quickly changed the conversation to something else. Even so, she stayed for tea, and instead of doing the washing up, my dad didn't say anything after she'd gone, but I could see that he was taken by her. He stood in the doorway for a long time, watching her leave. I began to see more and more of Louise. Suddenly, there were 3 of us going to the cinema, not 2. 3 of us having lunch together at the weekend. And inevitably there she was one morning when I came down to breakfast. I was old enough not to be shocked or upset that she'd stayed the night, but it was still a shock. I was happy for him, but secretly sad for myself. And, well, for some reason, she worried me too. My dad and I spoke about her only once. "Tell me something, Ben," he said one day. We were out walking, following the canal path as it wove through Bath Valley. It was something we often liked to do. "What do you think of Louise?" "I don't know," I said. In a way, she was perfect, but maybe that was what worried me. She was almost too good to be true. "You know there's never been anyone since your mother died," he said. He stopped and looked up at the sky. It was a lovely day. The sun was shining brilliantly. "But sometimes I wonder if I ought to be on my own. After all, You're almost 14. Any day now you'll be leaving home. What would you say if Louise and I were to... Dad, I just want you to be happy, I interrupted. The conversation made me feel uncomfortable. And what else could I say? Yes, he smiled at me. Thank you, Ben. You're a good boy. You'd have made your mother proud. And so they got married at Bath Registry Office. I was the best man and I made a speech at the lunch afterwards, tied a plastic dog poo to the car and threw confetti at them as they drove away. They had a week's honeymoon in Mallorca, and even that should have rung a slight alarm bell because my dad had told me that he'd really wanted to visit some of historical towns in the south of France. But Louise had her own way, and they must have had a good time because when they got back they were happy and relaxed, with deep suntans and loads of presents for me. I suppose the marriage was a success for about 3 months, but it all went very wrong very quickly after that. Although she agreed to come with us when we visited the new Tate Gallery in Millbank, Louise suddenly gave up her art course. She said it bored her, and anyway, she wanted to spend more time looking after my dad. This sounded all right at the time, and she may have even meant what she said, but the house got messier and messier. It was true that Dad and I had never been exactly tidy. Mrs. Jones, our old cleaner, was always complaining about us, but we never left dirty mugs in the bedroom, tangled hair in the sink, or crumpled clothes on the stairs. Louise did, and when Mrs. Jones complained one Tuesday morning, there was a nasty row, and the next thing I knew was that Mrs. Jones had resigned. Louise didn't do any more cooking after that. All the food she ever prepared seemed to have come out of tins or out of the freezer, and as my dad was a bit of a health freak, mealtimes were always a disappointment. Of course, neither of us had expected Louise to cook and clean for us. That wasn't the idea. My dad was really sorry she'd decided to give up her course at the university. The trouble was that she didn't seem to want to fit in, and the slightest argument always ended up with her flying into a rage, slamming doors and having tears. At heart, she was a bit of a spoiled child. She always had to have her own way. Shortly after she moved in, she suddenly insisted that Dad let me have my attic room because she wanted somewhere to paint. Dad came to me very reluctantly and asked me if I'd mind. And I didn't argue because I knew it would lead to another row and I didn't want him to be unhappy. So that was how I lost my room. Dad was unhappy though, and as the first year shuddered slowly by, I could see that he was getting worse and worse. He lost weight. The last traces of brown faded out of his hair. He never laughed any more. Louise had told him that his clothes were old-fashioned and made him look middle-aged, and one day she had given the whole lot to a charity shop. Now my dad wore jeans and t-shirts that didn't suit him and actually made him look older than he had before. He wasn't allowed to play classical music anymore. Louise preferred jazz, and most of the time the house was filled with the wail of trumpets and clarinets, fighting with the constant drone of the television, which she never seemed to turn off. And although she had loaded a few canvases and paints into my old room, she never actually produced anything. My dad never complained about her. I suppose this was part of his character. If I'd been married to her, I'd have probably walked out by now, but he seemed to accept everything meekly. However, one afternoon, towards the end of the summer, we found ourselves retracing our steps along the canal, and perhaps remembering our conversation from the year before. He turned to me and suddenly said, "I'm afraid Louise isn't a very good mother to you." I shrugged. I didn't know what to say. Perhaps it would have been better if I'd stayed single. He sighed and fell silent. "Louise has asked me to sell the house," he suddenly blurted out. "Why?" "She says it's pokey. She says she doesn't like living in the town. She wants me to move more into the countryside." "You're not going to, are you, Dad?" "I don't know. I'm thinking about it." He sounded so sad, and it should have been obvious to him, really. The marriage wasn't working, so why not divorce her? I almost said as much, but perhaps it was as well that I didn't, But things came to a head that very night, and I realised just how poisonous Louise could be. The two of them argued quite often. At least Louise did. Generally, my dad preferred to suffer in silence. But that night, my dad got his bank statement. It seemed that Louise had bought herself a whole load of designer clothes and stuff like that. She'd spent almost £1,000. He didn't shout at her, but he did criticise her, and suddenly she was screaming at him. I heard the whole thing from my bedroom. It was impossible not to. "I know you don't love me," she cried in a whiny, petulant voice. "You and Ben have been against me from the day I arrived." "I really don't think things are working out," my dad said quietly. "You want me to go? Is that it? You want a divorce?" "Perhaps we might both be happier." "Oh no, Andrew. If you want to divorce me, it's going to cost you. I want half of everything you have, and I'm entitled to it. You'll have to move out of this house, and that's just for a start. I'll tell the social workers how you've always left Ben on his own when he gets back from school. That's not allowed, so they'll take him away and you'll never see him again." "Louise." "I'll tell the university how cruel you've been to me. I'll tell them you battered me and you'll lose your job. I'll take your money. I'll take your son. I'll take everything. You wait and see." "Please, Louise, there's no need for this." After that, things quietened down. Louise knew she had my dad wrapped around her little finger, and every day she found new ways to be cruel to him. I think she only asked him to move in to upset him. She knew how happy we'd always been in that little house. As always, she had her way. About 3 months after the argument, my dad said he'd found somewhere. The somewhere was a little house called Twist Cottage. If Louise wanted to move into the countryside, she couldn't have chosen a better house than Twist Cottage, although it wasn't actually her who had chosen it. Dad found it. He came home one day with the details, and we went to see it that same afternoon. Twist Cottage was buried in the middle of a wood, not far from the aqueduct where the Avon Canal and the River Avon cross paths. It's a strange part of the world. There are small towns scattered all over the place, but walk a few metres into the woods and you seem to tumble into the middle of nowhere. Twist Cottage was as isolated as a cottage can be. It seemed to be imprisoned by the trees that surrounded it, as if they were afraid of it being found, and yet it was a very pretty building, straight out of a jigsaw puzzle, with a thatched roof, black beams and windows made of diamond-shaped pieces of glass. The cottage was as twisted as its name suggested. My dad said it was very old, Elizabethan or earlier, and time had worn away all the edges into curves. It had a big garden with a pond in the middle, and the grass was already long. "We'll need a lawnmower," Louise said. "Yes," my father agreed. "And I'm not doing the mowing." Now, I don't know a lot about house prices, but I do know that Avon is an expensive place to live, mainly because of all the Londoners who've bought second homes there. But the strange thing was that my dad bought Twist Cottage for only £100,000, which isn't very much at all, not in Avon. I wondered about that at the time. I also noticed that the estate agent, a Mr. Willoughby, seemed particularly happy to have sold it. He had an office in Bath, and the day he sold Twist Cottage, he gave everybody the day off. As it happened, one of my best mates at school was a boy called John Graham, and his older sister, Carol, was Mr. Willoughby's secretary. I was around at their house the week after the sale had been agreed, and she told me about the day off. In fact, she told me a lot more. "You're not really moving into Twist Cottage, are you?" she demanded. She was 19 years old, with frizzy hair and glasses. She had a slightly turned-up nose which suited her attitude to life. "Poor you." "What are you talking about?" I asked. "Mr. Willoughby never thought we'd sell it." "Is there something wrong with it?" "You could say that." Carol had been painting her nails with scarlet polish. She closed the bottle and came over to me. "It's haunted," she said. "Haunted?" "Mr. Willoughby says it's very haunted. He says it's the most haunted house he's ever known. John and I both burst out laughing. It's true! Do you believe in ghosts? John asked his sister. I don't believe in ghosts, I said. Well, there's something wrong with the house, Carol insisted. Why else do you think your dad got it so cheap? She probably wouldn't have bothered talking to us, but she had nothing to do while her nails dried, so that was how I found out the recent history of Twist Cottage. And it wasn't very nice. We're going to stop there, and I will read the second part of the story for you in the next video.